The invitation that never had my name. Have you ever watched your own family celebrate a future they secretly believed you didn't deserve? I have. 3 weeks before Christmas, my mother mailed invitations to everyone in our family. My sister received hers. My cousins received theirs. Even relatives who hadn't visited in years were invited. Mine never came. When I finally asked why, she smiled with the kind of calm that hurts more than anger. "It's nothing personal," she said. "We're trying to make a good impression." At the time, I thought she meant the expensive decorations, the catered dinner, or my sister's fiancé's wealthy parents. I didn't realize she meant me. According to my own family, I was the one thing that didn't belong in their perfect picture. What they couldn't possibly know was that the very people they were desperate to impress had already spent months trusting me with a business decision worth more money than anyone sitting at that table had ever imagined. They admired my work, respected my word, and believed I was the reason their future expansion would succeed. For weeks later, one unexpected conversation would expose every lie my family had told about me. By the end of that night, nobody would remember the expensive dinner. They would only remember the daughter they tried to erase. Success didn't change my family. It revealed them. When I was 21, I stopped chasing approval and started building a life nobody could take away. While everyone else measured success with job titles and luxury cars, I measured it with early mornings, impossible deadlines, and promises I refused to break. Every promotion, every contract, every milestone came from years of work nobody applauded. My family never asked how I was doing. They only assumed they already knew. To them, I was still the quiet daughter who would never become anything extraordinary. Correcting them became exhausting, so eventually I stopped trying. Sometimes silence is easier than explaining your worth to people who have already decided it doesn't exist. Looking back, that silence became the greatest advantage I never planned. Because when people underestimate you long enough, they stop watching. And the moment they stop watching, that's when everything changes. I still believe being left out of Christmas was the worst thing my family could do. I was about to discover they had planned something far more humiliating. And it started with a phone call that arrived the very next morning. The phone call that changed everything. The next morning, my phone rang at exactly 8:17. I almost ignored it. My mother's name had become something I associated with obligation, not affection. But something told me to answer. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize for leaving me out of Christmas. Instead, she spoke as if we had simply paused yesterday's conversation. "I need a favor," she said. 4 words. Not "I'm sorry." Not "can we talk?" Just a favor. My sister's future in-laws were arriving early, and one of the luxury catering companies had canceled at the last minute. She wanted me to help quietly behind the scenes because, according to her, I had always been good at handling practical things. I almost laughed. For 15 years, every achievement of mine had been dismissed as ordinary. Yet the moment their perfect celebration started falling apart, I suddenly became useful again. I asked a simple question. If I'm helping, am I finally invited to dinner? The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to give me the answer before she spoke. "It's better if you leave before the guests arrive." There it was. They didn't want my help. They wanted my labor without my presence. After hanging up, I stood in my kitchen staring out the window. A younger version of me would have driven over anyway, hoping this time would be different. That version no longer existed. Years of disappointment had taught me something my family never understood. Respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you stop giving away for free. I picked up my laptop and opened the presentation I was scheduled to deliver the following Monday. While my family obsessed over appearances, I was preparing for the largest negotiation of my career. The company I had spent 13 years building had been shortlisted by one of the country's most respected private investment groups for a nationwide expansion project. If everything went well, our business would grow faster in 6 months than it had in the previous 5 years combined. Ironically, the investors behind that deal would soon become unexpected guests in my family's story. None of us knew it yet, but our 2 completely different worlds were already moving toward the same room, the same conversation, and the same unforgettable night. At that moment, I believed saying no to my mother's request was the hardest decision I'd have to make. I had no idea someone from my past was already on their way to my office, carrying news that would change everything forever. The man who already knew my name asterisk asterisk. Sometimes life doesn't warn you that everything is about to change. It simply sends someone to your office. Asterisk asterisk 2 days after I refused my mother's request, my assistant knocked gently on my office door. "There's someone here asking for you," she said. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he insists you'll want to meet him." I glanced through the glass wall separating my office from the reception area. The man stood quietly in a charcoal overcoat, studying the framed photos of our earliest projects. He wasn't scrolling through his phone, or checking his watch. He was reading the story on the walls. That alone made him different from most visitors. When I stepped into the lobby, he smiled and extended his hand with quiet confidence. "Evelyn Carter?" he asked. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." His name was Richard Lawson, a senior partner at Lawson Capital, the investment group reviewing companies for a nationwide expansion project. We'd exchanged emails for weeks, but this was our first meeting in person. His handshake was firm, his attention genuine, and unlike most executives I'd met, he looked me in the eye instead of looking around the room for someone more important. Richard asked for a tour before discussing business. That surprised me. Most investors wanted spreadsheets, forecasts, and profit margins. He wanted to meet the people behind them. So I walked him through every department, introducing him to engineers, supervisors, customer support staff, and warehouse managers who had helped build the company from the ground up. He stopped to learn names, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked employees for things many executives would never even notice. By the time we reached the operations floor, he turned toward me and smiled. "Now I understand why your numbers are so consistent," he said. "Companies don't become exceptional because of buildings. They become exceptional because leaders create loyalty." It was one of the few compliments I'd ever received that felt completely free of exaggeration. Before leaving, he invited me to an exclusive winter reception where the investment group would officially announce its newest strategic partnerships. CEOs, investors, media representatives, and industry leaders from across the state would all be there. "You'll be one of our featured guests," he said. "People deserve to know the woman behind this company." I accepted without thinking twice, never imagining that invitation was about to collide with the Christmas dinner my family had tried so hard to keep me away from. Driving home that evening, I believed the reception would simply be another business event. I couldn't have been more wrong, because when I opened my mailbox that night, I found an envelope with my mother's handwriting, and inside was a request so unbelievable that I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. The favor she had the nerve to ask asterisk asterisk. Some requests don't sound cruel until you hear who's making them. Asterisk asterisk my mother's letter wasn't an apology. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't even an attempt to repair what had been broken. It was a list. A neatly handwritten list of things she hoped I would do before Christmas dinner. She wanted me to arrange transportation for several VIP guests, recommend a premium event photographer, and somehow convince one of my business contacts to donate luxury gift baskets for the family's holiday raffle. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she added one final sentence. Asterisk, of course, it would probably be better if you slipped out before everyone arrived. We don't want the evening becoming awkward. Asterisk I read those words twice, then folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Even now, she wasn't asking for her daughter. She was asking for another unpaid employee. The strangest part wasn't the request itself. It was how completely normal she believed it was. I refused to answer immediately. Experience had taught me that people often reveal their true intentions when they don't receive the response they expect. 2 days later, my younger sister, Lauren, appeared outside my office carrying 2 expensive coffees and wearing the brightest smile I'd seen from her in months. She looked around the reception area with open curiosity, quietly noticing the awards on the walls, the employees greeting me by name, and the confidence with which everyone moved through the building. "I had no idea your company was this big," she admitted before quickly changing the subject. She insisted she only wanted to spend time together, but within minutes the real reason surfaced. Their wedding planner had fallen behind schedule, several corporate guests needed hotel recommendations, and since I knew people, Maybe I could make a few calls. Then she reached across my desk and gently squeezed my hand. Please don't make Mom's life harder than it already is, she whispered. Not once did she ask how I felt after being excluded. Not once did she wonder whether I was hurt. To them, my pain had always been less important than their convenience. After she left, I walked into the conference room overlooking the city skyline. The winter reception Richard had invited me to was only 12 days away, and preparations were moving faster than expected. My executive team had just confirmed that several nationally recognized business leaders would attend, along with members of the regional press. For me, it was simply another professional milestone. I still had no reason to believe my family's world would collide with mine. Yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet feeling told me something unusual was coming. The same instinct that had protected me through years of impossible decisions was telling me to stay patient. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to chase anyone. It simply waits until every lie has nowhere left to hide. That night, just as I was locking my office, Richard Lawson called with unexpected news. His next sentence would connect my business life to my family in a way none of us could have predicted. And from that moment forward, there was no turning back. The name that changed everything ****. I thought Richard was calling to discuss business. Instead, he unknowingly connected two worlds that had been moving toward each other for years. ***, Evelyn, he said. There's something I just realized you should probably know. His voice carried the calm confidence it always did, but this time there was curiosity beneath it. One of the investors attending the Winter Partners reception had mentioned an upcoming Christmas dinner, hosted by the Harrison family. The name barely registered until he casually added another detail. I believe they're related to the family of Daniel Harrison, the man engaged to your sister. My grip tightened around the phone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Richard continued, completely unaware of what those words meant to me. Funny how small the world is. Some of our guests already know your family. I thanked him for letting me know, ended the call, and stared at the dark office window reflecting my own face. The two worlds my family had worked so hard to keep apart were no longer separate. They were already on the same road, heading toward the same destination. I drove home in complete silence. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood something my family didn't. They believed they were protecting their reputation by hiding me. In reality, they were gambling with it. Every story they had told about me, every half-truth, every carefully edited version of my life had been built on one dangerous assumption: that nobody important would ever discover the truth. They had underestimated my career for so many years that it never occurred to them someone else might value it. The irony almost made me smile. The investors respected me because of my work, while my own family dismissed me for the exact same reason. Success has a strange way of exposing people. It doesn't change their character. It simply removes the excuses they once hid behind. The following morning, my assistant placed a small envelope on my desk. There was no stamp, no return address, just my name written across the front in familiar handwriting. Inside was a single invitation to the Harrison Christmas dinner, with one sentence written beneath the printed details. Please come. We need everyone to believe we're one happy family. I read those words twice before quietly folding the card. Not once did it mention an apology. Not once did it acknowledge everything that had happened. They didn't suddenly want their daughter back. They wanted the appearance of a united family before influential guests arrived. They still had no idea the people they hoped to impress already knew exactly who I was. And if fate kept moving the way it had been, the biggest surprise of the entire holiday season wasn't waiting for me. It was waiting for them. And none of them would see it coming until it was far too late. The dinner I was never supposed to attend ***. The invitation sat on my desk for almost 2 days. ***, I picked it up countless times, wondering whether accepting it would reopen wounds I had spent years trying to heal. Part of me wanted to throw it away and pretend it had never arrived. The other part realized something important. This dinner was no longer about earning a seat at my family's table. It was about proving to myself that I no longer needed their approval. By Friday afternoon, I made my decision. I would attend, not as the daughter desperate to be accepted, but as the woman I had become without their support. If they chose to ignore me again, I would leave with the same peace I'd built long before that invitation reached my mailbox. What I didn't know was that someone else had already made plans that would change the entire evening before I even walked through the front door. The following Monday, Richard invited me to lunch after a strategy meeting. As we reviewed expansion plans, he casually mentioned that several families attending the Harrison Christmas dinner would also be present at the Winter Partners reception. It's always interesting watching personal relationships cross into business, he said with a smile. Sometimes you discover people are very different in private than they are in the boardroom. I nodded politely, hiding the irony behind those words. If only he knew. Before leaving, he handed me a sealed envelope containing the final reception schedule. My keynote introduction had been moved to the opening segment, instead of the closing ceremony. We want everyone to meet you first, he explained. You're the reason this partnership exists. His confidence never sounded rehearsed. It sounded earned. Walking back to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about how complete strangers had shown me more respect in a few months than my own family had shown me in years. Christmas Eve finally arrived. Snow covered the streets as I pulled into my parents' neighborhood just before sunset. Every house glowed with holiday lights, but one stood brighter than the rest. My parents' home looked perfect from the outside. Exactly the image my mother had always wanted the world to see. Luxury cars filled the driveway. Laughter drifted through the windows, and beautifully dressed guests carried wrapped gifts toward the front door. I remained in my car for a few quiet moments, taking one slow breath before stepping into the cold evening air. I wasn't nervous anymore. I wasn't angry either. The years had taken both emotions and replaced them with something far more dangerous, clarity. I adjusted my coat, walked toward the front entrance, and reached for the brass handle. The moment that door opened, I came face to face with someone who recognized me instantly. And the expression on his face told me my family had made a mistake they could never take back. The first person who spoke my name. The front door had barely opened when the evening stopped feeling ordinary. Standing in the entryway was a distinguished man in his 60s, greeting guests with the effortless confidence of someone used to leading a room. The moment our eyes met, recognition flashed across his face. His smile widened immediately. "Evelyn Carter," he said warmly, extending his hand before anyone else could react. "I was hoping you'd make it." It was William Harrison, Daniel's grandfather, and the founder of the Harrison Group. We'd met twice during investment meetings, but I never imagined our next conversation would happen on my parents' doorstep. Before I could answer, he turned toward the guests nearby with genuine excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the remarkable entrepreneur I mentioned last month. If more companies were run with her integrity, business would be a much better place." Conversations slowed. Heads turned. For the first time in my life, I watched complete strangers look at me with admiration while my own family stood frozen only a few feet away. My mother's smile disappeared so quickly it was almost painful to watch. She hurried across the foyer, forcing the cheerful expression she reserved for important company. "Mr. Harrison," she laughed nervously, "I didn't realize you two had already met." William looked genuinely surprised. "Of course we have," he replied. "We've been discussing expansion opportunities for months. Your daughter is one of the brightest business leaders I've worked with in years." My father gripped his drink without saying a word. Lauren stared at me in complete disbelief, while Daniel's confident expression quietly gave way to confusion. It was obvious none of them had expected anyone in that room to know who I really was. My mother quickly tried changing the subject, inviting everyone toward the dining room before more questions could be asked. The conversation moved on. But the atmosphere didn't. Every guest who had witnessed those few seconds now looked at me differently. Curiosity had entered the room, and curiosity has a dangerous habit of demanding answers. Dinner began with polished smiles and carefully rehearsed conversations. Yet beneath the elegant decorations, I could feel tension growing stronger with every passing minute. William kept asking thoughtful questions about logistics, leadership, and the future of my company. I answered politely, never once trying to impress anyone. Ironically, the less I tried to prove myself, the more interested everyone became. Across the table, my mother interrupted twice, redirecting conversations before they could become too personal. My father remained unusually quiet, avoiding eye contact almost the entire evening. Then, just as dessert was being served, William lifted his glass and smiled. "Before tonight ends," he said, "I'd love everyone to hear the incredible story of how Evelyn built her company from nothing." My mother's hand tightened around her wine glass. She knew exactly what was about to happen, because for the first time in years, she could no longer control the story being told. And the very next question William asked would expose a lie my family had repeated for nearly 15 years, in front of everyone who mattered. The question my family couldn't answer. Some lies survive for years, until one honest question walks into the room. **** William Harrison rested his glass on the table, and smiled in my direction. "Evelyn, I know your journey because I've had the privilege of working with you. But your family must know the whole story even better than I do." He turned toward my parents with genuine curiosity. "Tell us, what was the moment you realized she was going to build something extraordinary?" The room became unusually quiet. It sounded like a harmless question, but to my family, it was a trap they never saw coming. My mother forced a smile, glancing toward my father as if hoping he would answer first. He lowered his eyes to his plate. Lauren gently adjusted her napkin, avoiding everyone's gaze. For years they had told people I was simply finding my way. Now they were being asked to describe a journey they had never cared enough to understand. William waited patiently, believing they were searching for the right memory. The truth was far simpler. There wasn't one. After several uncomfortable seconds, my mother finally spoke. "Evelyn has always been independent," she said carefully. "She preferred keeping work to herself." It sounded reasonable until William chuckled softly. "Really? That's interesting," he replied. "Because every time we met, she spoke with enormous respect about the values she learned growing up. I assumed she came from a family deeply involved in supporting her career." My mother's smile froze. She hadn't expected the conversation to move in that direction. Before she could recover, another guest joined in. "I read an article about your company last month," a woman from the investment board said. "Didn't you start it from a tiny rented office with only 3 employees?" William nodded proudly. "That's right. She turned down 2 acquisition offers because she refused to sacrifice her employees for quick profits. That decision alone told me everything I needed to know about her character." Compliments continued flowing around the table, each one making my family's silence even louder. For the first time, people weren't interested in expensive decorations or holiday traditions. They were interested in the daughter sitting quietly among them, the daughter her own family had almost hidden from view. Then Daniel, who had spent most of the evening listening instead of speaking, looked directly at my parents with an expression that was impossible to read. "I'm confused," he admitted politely. "If Evelyn has achieved all of this, why have I barely heard her name until tonight?" The question wasn't asked with anger. It was asked with sincere curiosity, making it impossible to dismiss. My mother's lips parted, but no words came out. My father slowly removed his glasses, staring at the table, as though an answer might somehow appear between the dinner plates. Across the room, I noticed several guests quietly exchanging glances. The atmosphere had changed completely. Moments earlier, everyone had been celebrating Christmas. Now they were witnessing something far more revealing. The collapse of a story that had taken years to build. But none of us realized the biggest shock of the night was still waiting. Because the next person to speak knew a truth that not even I was expecting to hear. The truth they couldn't silence. Just when everyone thought the questions were over, another voice quietly changed the entire evening. It belonged to Margaret Collins, one of the senior board members at Lawson Capital. She had been listening carefully from the opposite end of the table, saying almost nothing since dinner began. Setting her glass down, she smiled politely at my parents. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she began, "but Evelyn speaks about integrity the way most people speak about family traditions. We've always assumed those values came from home." The sentence wasn't meant to embarrass anyone. It was simply honest. Yet honesty has a way of exposing people who have spent years hiding behind appearances. My mother nodded weakly, trying to agree without actually answering. Before she could redirect the conversation again, Margaret continued. During our due diligence, we interviewed dozens of people who worked with Evelyn over the last decade. Every single one described her as humble, dependable, and fiercely loyal. That's extremely rare in business today. She turned toward me with genuine respect. Those qualities can't be faked for that many years. Around the table, several guests nodded in agreement. For the first time all night, my family wasn't controlling the conversation. They were simply trying to survive it. Daniel slowly looked from me to my parents, then back again. The confidence he had carried into the house had completely disappeared. "Evelyn," he asked carefully, "have you really been running this company all these years?" I answered with the same calm voice I'd used throughout the evening. "Yes. We started small. It took 13 years to reach where we are today." He frowned slightly. "Then why was I always told you were still figuring things out?" "No accusation." No raised voice. Just one sincere question. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said all night. My father finally inhaled as if preparing to speak, but no explanation came. There wasn't one that could erase years of neglect. My mother attempted a nervous smile. "Families sometimes simplify things," she whispered. But even she seemed unconvinced by her own words. Across the table, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology either. Watching them struggle wasn't satisfying. It was simply the inevitable consequence of pretending the truth didn't exist for far too long. William Harrison broke the silence by standing to his feet. Every conversation stopped instantly. "I'd like to say something," he announced warmly. "In my career, I've invested in remarkable businesses, but I place even greater value on remarkable people. Evelyn earned our respect long before we knew anything about her personal life. She never once asked for special treatment, never mentioned influential connections, and never used her family name to open a single door. She let her work speak for itself." He lifted his glass toward me. "That's the kind of character success can't create. It only reveals." Glasses slowly rose around the room as guests joined the toast. I thanked them quietly, never expecting the evening to become about me. But as I looked across the table, I noticed my mother staring at the guests with growing panic. She wasn't worried about Christmas anymore. She was worried about what would happen after everyone left. Because one person had just stepped into the dining room carrying a folder that contained information capable of changing far more than a family reputation. And when that folder was opened, even William Harrison would be left speechless. The folder that ended the lies. The man carrying the folder wasn't trying to steal the spotlight. In fact, he looked almost uncomfortable walking into the dining room. He apologized for interrupting, then turned toward William Harrison. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "These are the final partnership documents you asked me to bring before tomorrow's board meeting." William thanked him and accepted the folder, planning to set it aside until his eyes landed on the cover page. He smiled and looked directly at me. "Perfect timing," he said. "Everyone here should probably know that these papers officially make Evelyn Carter's company our lead logistics partner for the next 5 years." A wave of quiet surprise swept through the room. The agreement wasn't just another contract. It represented one of the largest investments the Harrison Group had approved that year. William continued speaking with unmistakable pride. "After reviewing every proposal in the country, our board voted unanimously. Evelyn's company outperformed every competitor in reliability, customer satisfaction, and long-term planning. There wasn't even a close second." Guests immediately began applauding. Some stood to congratulate me, while others asked questions about the expansion. Across the table, my parents remained completely still. Their carefully protected image had just collided with a truth too large to hide. My mother tried one final time to regain control. Rising slowly from her chair, she forced a smile and addressed the room. "We've always known Evelyn was capable of wonderful things," she said. "She's just always preferred staying out of the spotlight." It was the first time all evening she had attempted to rewrite the story instead of avoiding it. Unfortunately for her, the room had already heard too much. Daniel looked toward her with visible confusion. "But that's not what we were told," he said quietly. "When I first asked about Evelyn months ago, you told us she was still searching for a stable career and wasn't interested in business." Nobody interrupted him. Nobody rushed to defend the explanation. The silence itself became an answer. William's expression softened, not with anger, but with disappointment. Success doesn't happen by accident, he said calmly. Someone who builds a company like this deserves encouragement long before recognition arrives. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, yet everyone understood exactly who needed to hear them. I finally stood. Not because I wanted attention, but because the room deserved honesty. I don't need anyone to agree with my choices, I said evenly. I only wish my family had believed in me before strangers did. My voice never rose above conversation level. Yet every word carried across the dining room. For years I thought I had done something wrong. I worked harder, stayed quieter, and kept hoping the next achievement would finally make me enough. It never did. The truth is, the problem was never my success. It was that my success no longer fit the version of me some people wanted to believe. No one spoke. Even the holiday music seemed to disappear beneath the silence. I picked up my coat, thanked William for his kindness, and wished everyone a Merry Christmas. As I reached the front door, William called my name one last time. Evelyn, he said with a smile. The partnership begins in January. But I have a feeling tonight was only the beginning of something much bigger. He was right, because less than 48 hours later, my father appeared outside my office alone. And for the first time in my life, he wasn't coming to give advice. He was coming to ask for forgiveness. The apology that came too late. It's strange how quickly pride disappears when the truth finally catches up. ****, 2 mornings after Christmas, my assistant called to tell me someone had been waiting in the lobby for almost 20 minutes. He says he'll wait as long as it takes, she whispered. I walked out expecting a client. Instead, I found my father standing alone beside the reception window, his hands folded tightly in front of him. He looked older than I remembered. Not because of the gray in his hair, but because the confidence he'd carried his entire life seemed to have disappeared overnight. He wasn't admiring the awards on the walls or pretending to understand the business. He was simply watching my employees greet one another with genuine respect. As I approached, he turned slowly. I didn't know, he admitted quietly. I never imagined you'd built all of this. For the first time in years, there were no excuses in his voice, just exhaustion. I invited him into my office, not because everything was forgiven, but because I had promised myself I would never become the kind of person who refused someone the conversation I'd once begged for. For several minutes neither of us spoke. My father looked around the office, noticing framed photographs from company milestones, thank you letters from clients, and a wall covered with pictures of employees celebrating promotions. Finally, he broke the silence. I spent so many years believing success looked one way, he said. Big titles, famous companies, expensive suits. I never stopped long enough to see what you were actually building. He lowered his head before continuing. When your mother said keeping you away from dinner would avoid uncomfortable questions. I agreed. I told myself it was only one evening. But deep down I knew it was wrong. Hearing those words should have felt like victory. Instead, they felt heavy. Some apologies don't erase the past. They simply confirmed that the pain was real all along. I thanked him for being honest, but honesty alone couldn't restore birthdays, holidays, and family moments that had already disappeared forever. Before leaving, my father reached into his coat pocket and placed a small envelope on my desk. Inside was an old photograph of me at 12 years old, proudly holding the tiny lemonade stand where I'd earned my very first profit. I remembered that day instantly. I also remembered waiting hours for my family to notice how excited I was. They never did. My father smiled sadly. I found this in the attic last night, he said. Looking at it, I realized you've been the same person your whole life. We just stopped paying attention. He stood, hesitated for a moment, then quietly asked, do you think someday we could start over? I looked at the photograph one last time before carefully placing it back inside the envelope. Maybe, I answered honestly. But this time, we'll start with the truth. He nodded without arguing and walked toward the door. I watched him leave, feeling something unexpected. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Just peace. I believed that conversation had finally closed the chapter between us. I couldn't have been more wrong, because one final visitor was about to arrive with news that would change my family's future forever. The table I finally chose. People think the best revenge is watching those who hurt you lose everything. They're wrong. Asterisk asterisk, the best revenge is reaching a place where their approval no longer has the power to change your peace. A week after my father visited my office, my assistant knocked softly before stepping inside. "There's another visitor," she said. "She says she'll only take 5 minutes." I already knew who it was. My mother stood in the lobby exactly as she always had, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and convinced she could still fix every situation with the right words. But something was different this time. She wasn't carrying confidence. She was carrying fear. The Christmas dinner had become the talk of every family connected to the Harrisons. Business circles had heard the story too. Not because I told anyone, but because the truth has a way of traveling farther than gossip ever can. For the first time in her life, my mother couldn't control the narrative. She followed me into my office and remained standing. "People are judging us," she said quietly. "They think we're terrible parents." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "They're judging what happened, Mom. Those aren't the same thing." She tried explaining that everything she'd done had been to protect the family, to avoid awkward questions, to keep peace during important moments. They were the same reasons I'd heard my entire life. Different words. Same excuse. Finally, her voice cracked. "I never thought you'd become this successful." The sentence hung in the room. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. She hadn't underestimated my business. She had underestimated me. I smiled gently, not with victory, but with understanding. "That's the difference between us," I said. "I spent years hoping you'd believe in me. You spent years believing I never would." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Some silences don't need to be filled. They simply tell the truth better than words ever could. As she turned to leave, she paused at the doorway. "Will you come to next Christmas?" she asked without looking back. It was the question I'd wanted to hear for years. Yet standing in my own office, surrounded by the life I'd built without anyone's permission, I realized something had changed. "Maybe," I answered honestly. "But if I come, it won't be because I need a seat at your table. It'll be because we've built a new one together." She nodded once and quietly walked away. That Thanksgiving, I didn't reserve a table at an expensive restaurant or a country club. I hosted dinner inside our company's distribution center after the final trucks returned from their routes. Long wooden tables stretched across the warehouse floor between rows of shelves that had once held nothing but dreams and borrowed equipment. My employees brought their families. Drivers laughed with warehouse teams. Children ran through the aisles wearing paper turkey crowns. Every chair had a name on it. Every guest was welcomed. Every story was heard. Before dinner began, I looked around the room and realized something that changed me forever. Family isn't always the people who share your last name. Sometimes it's the people who celebrate your victories even when they gain nothing from them. If my journey taught me anything, it's this. Never shrink yourself so someone else can feel taller. The people who truly belong in your life will never ask you to hide your light just to protect their comfort. Build your future anyway. Keep your integrity anyway. Keep showing up anyway. One day, the same qualities people overlooked will become the very reason the right people choose you. And if you've ever felt invisible at your own family's table, remember this. The world is full of tables that still have your name waiting on them. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't being invited back. It's discovering you were always meant to build your own. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that their worth is never decided by the people who failed to see it. Leave a comment telling me the moment you stopped chasing someone else's approval. Subscribe for more stories, and I'll see you in the next one.